Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is markpaul Dandoy from BPED 1B. I will be discussing about the timeline of the Philippine history. But before that, I would like you to have a knowledge or background about what is history first. So let's move on. What is history? History is the analysis and interpretation of the human past, enabling us to study continuity and changes that are taking place over time. It is an act of both investigation and imagination that seeks to explain how people have changed over time. History is a means to understand the past and the present. So that's the meaning of history. So let's move on to our main topic. Main topic is to explain the timeline of the Philippine history. So yung timeline na to is hindi buo, parang summary lang or namili lang po ako ng timeline na i-discuss. So meron tayong apat na century dito. Okay? The early Philippines, the 19th century, the 20th century, and the 21st century. So first is the early Philippines. So in the early Philippines, we have in 1556 to 1598. The Philippines is named after King Philip II of Spain, and it was a Spanish colony for over 300 years. Okay? Yung nakikita nyo to, siya si King Philip II. In 3000 BC and 2000 BC, people learned to farm. They grew rice and domesticated animals. Okay, next. In the 10th AD century, Filipinos traded with China, and by the 12th century AD, the Arab merchants reached in the Philippines and they introduced Islam. Next, in 1521, Ferdinand Magellan sailed across the Pacific. He landed in the Philippines and claimed them for Spain. Magellan baptized a chief called Humabon and hoped to make him a puppet ruler on behalf of the Spanish crown. In 1571, the Spaniards landed in Luzon. Here they built the city of Intramuros, later called Manila, which became the capital of the Philippines. Next, in 1762, the British captured Manila. They held it for 2 years, but they handed it back in 1764 under the terms of the Treaty of Paris, signed in 1763. Okay, let's move on naman in the 90th century. Okay, ayan si Rizal. Ayan yung mga sundalo ng Amerika. The KKK. Okay, in 1872, there was a rebellion in Cavite, but it was quickly crushed. Okay, next. In 1861 to 1896, Rizal wrote 2 novels. It is Noli Me Tangere, which means Touch Me Not, and El Filibusterismo, or the Filibusterer, which stoked the fires of nationalism. In 1892, Jose Rizal founded a movement called Liga Filipina, which called for reform rather than revolution. As a result, Rizal was arrested and exiled to the Bitan on Mindanao. Okay, in August 1896, began a revolution. Jose Rizal was accused of supporting the revolution. In December 30, 1896, although he did not, parang kahit hindi niya sinuportahan yung revolution na yon, pinatay pa rin siya. Okay? In 1898, dumating na or it came the war between the USA and the Spain. And in April 30, 1898, the Americans defeated the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay. Okay, natalo na nila dito yung mga Spanish. Okay? Mga bayani dati yung mga Amerikano sa atin kasi tinalo nila yung Spanish. Okay, tinalo nila yung mga Spanyol. Okay, let's move on in June 12. Filipino revolutionaries had surrounded in Manila. Their leader is Emilio Aguinaldo that declared the Philippines independent. Okay, June 12, unang dineclare ni Emilio Aguinaldo na yung Pilipinas ay malaya na. Okay, in February 4, 1899, the war between American forces in Manila and the Filipinos began. In February 4, 1899, dito na nagsimula yung laban between Amerika at mga Pilipino. In 1902, the Filipino-American War lasted when Aguinaldo was captured. So let's move on naman in the 20th century. I think dito sa 20th century, ito yung pinakamahaba na maraming nangyari. American rule in the Philippines was paternalistic. They called their policy benevolent assimilation. They wanted to Americanize the Filipinos, but they never quite succeeded. However, they did do some goods. Yung mga American teachers were sent to the Philippines in a ship called Thomas, and nadagdagan nila yung literacy or yung education ng Pilipinas. Yun yung nagawa ng Amerika sa Pilipinas. Yun yung isa. So let's move on. In 1935, the Philippines were made a Commonwealth and were semi-independent. Manuel Quezon became a president. 1945, USA promised that the Philippines would become completely independent. Pero parang hindi naman nangyari yun. January 2, 1941, Japan. Dumating na yung Japan, captured Manila. In December 10, 1941, Japanese troops invaded the Philippines. So dito na nagsisimula. In December 1941, Japan attacked the US at Pearl Harbor. We are familiar naman doon, di ba? In May 6, 1942, all the Philippines were in Japanese hands. So, May 6, 1942, hawak na tayo ng mga Japanese. Hapones na. October 1944, American troops returned to the Philippines. Bumalik sila sa Pilipinas ng October 1944. Okay, in February 1945, they recaptured Manila. So, in July 4, 1946, the Philippines became independent. Then, Manuel Rojas was the first president of the newly independent nation. In 1965, Ferdinand Marcos was elected as a president of the Philippines. And 1969, he was re-elected. Siya pa din. Ayan yung Pilipinas, independence. In September 21, 1972, Marcos declared martial law. He imposed a curfew, suspended Congress, and arrested opposition leader. 1980, opposition leader Benigno Aquino went into exile in the USA. And when he returned, August 21, 1983, binaril siya ng isang lalaki. As in, napanood ko yung video nung kung paano siya binaril. As in, sa likod. Pumuntay na lalaki sa likod niya, then binaril siya. Ayan siya. Kabababa niya lang ng aeroplano that time. In February 1986, Marcos called an election. The opposition united behind Cory Aquino. Cory Aquino is the widow of Benigno. 1992, Mount Pinatubo erupted and covered Clark in volcanic ash, forcing the Americans to leave. Ayan ang nangyari. 1993, Americans left in the Subic Bay. 1992, Fidel Ramos became a president. He improved the infrastructure in the Philippines, including the electricity supply. Industry was privatized and the economy began to grow more rapidly. And at the end of the 1990s, the Philippine economy entered a crisis. Ito naman tayo sa 1998, Joseph Estrada, known as ERAP, became a president. And Estrada was accused of corruption and he was impeached in November 2000. And Estrada was not convicted. 2004, Estrada was forced to leave office and Vice President Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo replaced him and she was re-elected. Ayan si ERAP and ayan si Vice President Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo. So let's move on in the 21st century, in the last century. Today, the Philippines is still poor, but things are changing. 2010, the Philippines economy has grown at about 6% a year. 2016, the Philippines launched its first satellite. And that satellite was called Diwata number 1. In June 30, 2016, presidency of Rodrigo Duterte began, following his inaugurations as the 60th President of the Philippines, succeeding Benigno Aquino III. He has carried out a war on drugs that has led to the death of over 12,000 Filipinos to date, mostly in urban poor. Okay, that was President Rodrigo Duterte, and that is war on drugs. And 2020 up until now, 2021, we are experiencing global pandemic called COVID-19. 2020, the population of the Philippines was 106 million. That was the COVID-19 and the first satellite that Philippines launched, the Diwata number 1. And that's the end of our discussion. I hope na may natutunan kayo. And that's the timeline of the Philippine history. Thank you for listening. Again, my name is markpaul from BPED 1.